My husband's sister broke into my dead grandmother's beach house, forged my name on fake rent checks, changed every lock, and swore a judge would never take her precious new home away from her. I stood in my grandmother's driveway and stared at a lock I didn't recognize. The porch light was on. It was almost midnight. Somewhere inside, a television murmured through the window, blue light flickering against curtains that weren't mine. "That's not our lock," Ethan said. He said it quietly, like saying it louder might make it true faster. I tried my key anyway. It slid halfway in and stopped, useless, like it belonged to a different house now. I knocked. Nobody answered. I knocked again, harder, until my knuckles ached. The door opened 4 inches, chain still latched. Renee's face appeared in the gap, lit orange from the hallway light behind her. "You can't just show up here," she said. "This is my house, Renee." "Not tonight it isn't." She said it like she'd rehearsed it. Maybe she had. I heard Tyler's voice somewhere behind her, asking who was at the door. Ava's cartoon still playing. Someone's shoes lined up by the mat that used to be my grandmother's mat, the one with the faded anchor pattern Vivian bought at a flea market in 1994. "Open the door," Ethan said. Renee smiled instead. Then she pulled out her phone and dialed, right in front of us, and said, loud enough for the whole street, that her brother and his wife were trespassing on her property and refusing to leave. I didn't scream. I went quiet instead. That's worse. Trust me. I was 34 years old when this happened, and until that night in the driveway, I'd have told you my marriage was solid ground. Ethan and I had been married 7 years. We met at a coworker's wedding in Raleigh, both of us bored out of our minds at the same table, and somehow that boredom turned into 11 years together, 7 of them married. He worked in logistics for a freight company. I managed accounts for a regional insurance firm. We didn't have kids yet. We had a modest house in Greensboro, 2 dogs, and a beach house we never planned on. My grandmother Vivian left me that beach house 5 years earlier, in her will, along with a note that said she hoped I'd fill it with the same kind of laughter she did. It sat at 14 Turn Lane in Marsh Cove, North Carolina. 2 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, faded blue shutters, a wraparound porch that caught the wind off the sound every evening around 6. She'd bought it in 1988 for $11,000, back when Marsh Cove was still mostly fishing families and empty lots, long before the developers found it and drove the prices up. By the time she died, it was worth close to $410,000. Paid off, free and clear, just mine. She used to tell me stories about the early years there, hauling furniture in off a borrowed truck, learning to patch a roof herself because she couldn't afford to hire it out, planting the 2 live oaks in the front yard that had grown, by the time I inherited the place, tall enough to shade the whole porch by early afternoon. The will reading itself happened in a small conference room above a bank in Marsh Cove 5 years earlier, with a lawyer named Phyllis Dorset reading through Vivian's wishes in a flat, businesslike voice that didn't match the woman being described in the document. Vivian left her wedding ring to Carol. She left a modest sum, $8,000, split evenly between her 3 great-nephews on her late husband's side. And she left the house at Turn Lane to me, specifically, by name, with a handwritten note clipped to the deed that said she'd watched me fall in love with that porch since I was 19 years old, and couldn't imagine handing it to anyone who wouldn't sit on it the way I did, barefoot, coffee going cold, in no hurry to be anywhere else. Renee wasn't in the room. She'd had a scheduling conflict, she said, something with the kids, and asked Carol to fill her in afterward. I remember Carol relaying the terms to her over the phone that same evening, and I remember hearing secondhand that Renee's first reaction wasn't disappointment so much as disbelief, like the outcome itself had to be some kind of oversight that would eventually get corrected. I loved that house the way you love a person. Ethan and I drove down once a month in the summer, sometimes more. The rest of the year we rented it out through a property manager named Greg Halloran, who'd known my grandmother since she moved to Marsh Cove and who ran the tightest operation I'd ever seen. Signed leases, security deposits held in escrow, monthly statements emailed on the first of every month like a Swiss watch. The rental income covered the property taxes, the insurance, and left a little left over for repairs. It wasn't a moneymaker. It was a memory I got to keep paying rent on, and I was fine with that trade. Ethan's sister Renee never understood why I wouldn't just hand it to her. Renee was 31, 3 years younger than Ethan, and she'd spent most of her adult life a half step behind wherever she wanted to be. She married young, to a contractor named Danny, and they had 2 kids, Tyler and Ava, 10 and 7. The marriage fell apart 2 years before all of this, messy and expensive, and Renee ended up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Charlotte with a lease she could barely afford, and a car that needed brakes she kept putting off. Ethan and I built our marriage on a kind of easy division of labor when it came to his family. I handled the beach house, the finances, the practical decisions. He handled Renee, or tried to, running interference the way older siblings sometimes do for younger ones who never quite grew out of needing it. It worked for years because it never really got tested. Renee's request had always been small enough to absorb without much friction, a loan here, a favor there, nothing that ever forced Ethan to choose between his wife and his sister in any way that mattered. I understand now how much of our peace depended on that arrangement never being tested, and how little either of us had actually prepared for what would happen once it finally was. I want to be fair to her, because fair matters to me even now. Renee had a hard few years. Divorce is brutal. Single parenting on one income is brutal. I understood that. What I never understood was the way she treated other people's things like problems to be solved by simply taking them. The stories were old by the time I married into the family, but everyone told them like fresh fresh gossip anyway. In 2015, she house sat for her parents while they were in Florida for 6 weeks, and somehow in that window, a ring belonging to her mother went missing. A $3,000 ring, an anniversary gift from 30 years earlier. Renee swore up and down she never touched it. 2 years later, Carol, Ethan's mother, found a pawn ticket in an old coat pocket while cleaning out a closet. She never said anything to Renee about it. She just quietly stopped wearing rings around her. In 2018, Renee borrowed Ethan's car for a weekend and returned it with a crushed bumper and a story about a hit and run in a parking garage. The dealership's own security footage, which Ethan pulled without telling anyone, showed Renee backing into a concrete post at 11 at night, alone, nobody else in the frame. He never confronted her about it. He paid the $1,100 in repairs himself and let the story stand. At Christmas in 2019, she painted her parents' living room black. Not a dark gray, not an accent wall. The whole room, floor to ceiling, while Carol and her father were out running errands. She said she was helping them modernize. They repainted it themselves the following spring, off-white, and nobody in the family ever brought it up again. Then there was the beach house itself, years before any of this. In August of 2022, Ethan and I came down for our usual monthly weekend and found a hair tie on the bathroom counter that wasn't mine, and a bottle of sunscreen in the shower that neither of us had bought. Greg checked the booking calendar and found nothing scheduled for that window. It took 2 phone calls to figure out what had happened. Renee had taken a spare key off the hook in Ethan's parents' kitchen, the one Vivian had given Carol years earlier for emergencies, and spent a long weekend at the house with a boyfriend I'd never even met, never asking either of us, never mentioning it until she was caught. She apologized when confronted, said she didn't think it was a big deal since the house was sitting empty anyway, and Ethan let it go after she promised it wouldn't happen again. I remember being angrier about that incident than he was, and I remember him telling me I was overreacting, that it was just a weekend, that Renee didn't mean any harm by it. I let that word sit with me for a long time afterward. Harm. As if intention was the only thing that mattered, and not the simple fact that she'd let herself into a house that wasn't hers and stayed there anyway. I noticed a pattern nobody else seemed willing to name out loud. Renee didn't ask. She acted first, and then she managed the consequences afterward, usually by crying, or by explaining that she'd been trying to help, or by simply waiting until the anger cooled and the subject changed. It always worked. Every time it worked. She started hinting about the beach house within a year of Vivian's death. Small comments at first. Must be nice having a whole house just sitting there. Then bigger ones. At Thanksgiving in 2023, she said, directly across the table, that it seemed unfair that I had 2 houses and she had none. Like housing was a finite resource I was hoarding out of spite. I told her as gently as I could that the beach house wasn't a spare room. It was my grandmother's, left specifically to me, and it paid for itself through renters who signed leases and paid deposits like everyone else in the world had to. She didn't say anything back. She just looked at Ethan like she expected him to correct me. He didn't. Not that time. I remember being grateful for that and not realizing yet how much that gratitude would cost me later, one small pitulation at a time. The call that started all of it came on a Tuesday night in March, a little after 9. Renee was crying before I even said hello. She'd lost her job at the call center 2 weeks earlier, she said. Some kind of restructuring. Nothing she could have prevented. She was $1,100 behind on rent. Her landlord had already posted a notice on her door. Tyler needed new shoes for school. Ava had a dentist appointment they couldn't pay for. She wasn't asking for money, she said. She just needed somewhere to stay. 2 weeks. Maybe 3 at the absolute most, while she found a new job and got back on her feet. Ethan took the phone into the other room. When he came back, his face had that particular softness it got whenever his sister was involved. A softness I used to find endearing before I understood what it actually was. It's just 2 weeks, he said. The house is empty until the summer renters anyway. I want to be honest about my own part in this, because that matters too. I said yes. I said it against every instinct I had, because I loved my husband, and because I told myself 2 weeks was 2 weeks, and because some small, foolish part of me wanted to be the bigger person for once, the one who didn't hold grudges over a black living room and a crushed bumper from years earlier. I called Renee myself and laid it out plainly. 2 weeks, starting March 3rd. No lease needed for something that short, but I wanted it in writing. A simple move-in and move-out date, just so everyone was clear. She agreed immediately, grateful, tearful, promising she'd treat the place like it was made of glass. 2 weeks became 4. 4 became 6. Every visit brought a new excuse. Tyler had strep throat the week she was supposed to leave. Then a job interview came up, a good one, she said, and she couldn't risk missing the follow-up call by being mid-move. Ethan drove down alone one weekend in late March to check on things, and when he came back, he mentioned, almost in passing, a black polo shirt hanging in the hall closet with a little embroidered wave stitched over the pocket, and the words, "the Tide Line," beneath it. He'd asked her about it. She'd laughed it off, said it was nothing, just something for extra cash, don't make it weird. Neither of us thought much of it at the time. We had bigger things to worry about, we told ourselves. That was a mistake I'd come to understand fully later. Then Ava's school called about a scheduling issue that apparently required Renee to stay local through the end of the grading period. Each excuse was small enough on its own to seem unreasonable to argue with. Stacked together, they added up to something else entirely, and I was too polite or too tired or too married to Ethan's patience with his sister to say so out loud. Halfway through week 5, I called to check in and mentioned carefully that the summer renters were scheduled to arrive June 1st, which gave her a hard deadline now instead of a soft one. I know, she said. We're basically packed already. 2 days after that call, Carol called me instead. Her voice pitched into the same careful, pleading register I'd hear so much more of before this was over. Renee had called her crying, apparently, saying I was pressuring her, rushing her out with nowhere to go, threatening to put her children on the street. Carol asked if I could just give it a little more time, for the kids' sake, just until the school year wrapped up properly. I told her the summer renters had a contract, a family with a disabled teenager who'd specifically requested that house for its single-story layout, and that I couldn't simply cancel on them because Renee needed more time. Carol sighed in a way that suggested I'd disappointed her somehow, and said she'd talk to Renee again, though nothing about her tone suggested she planned to push very hard. I hung up feeling like I'd been maneuvered into playing the villain in a story I hadn't agreed to be part of, and it wouldn't be the last time that feeling found me that spring. They were not packed. I found that out the way I found out most things about Renee during that stretch, which is to say I found out too late. I drove down alone one Saturday in mid-April, ostensibly to drop off a check for the property tax installment, but really because something about Renee's tone on the phone had started to unsettle me in a way I couldn't quite name. What I found looked less like a temporary stay and more like a household settling in for the long haul. Ava's height had been marked in pencil on the doorframe of the smaller bedroom, 4 little lines climbing upward with dates beside them. There was a whiteboard calendar on the refrigerator with Tyler's baseball practice schedule mapped out through the end of June. A potted herb garden sat on the back porch railing, basil and mint, the kind of thing you plant when you expect to be somewhere long enough to harvest it. I asked Renee about the pencil marks on the doorframe, keeping my voice as even as I could manage. Kids grow, she said, with a shrug, like the question itself was strange. I'm not going to stop tracking her height just because we're staying somewhere temporary. It doesn't look temporary, Renee. You're reading way too much into a pencil mark, Dana. She laughed, short and dismissive, and turned back to the dishes she was washing in my grandmother's sink, and I remember standing there in the doorway feeling something I couldn't name yet, a kind of vertigo, like the ground under the conversation had quietly shifted somewhere I hadn't been watching. The call that broke the illusion came from the actual renters, a retired couple named the Whitfields who'd booked the house for the first 2 weeks of April, a full 6 weeks before Renee was even supposed to have been there in the first place. Mrs. Whitfield's voice shook on the phone. She said there were people already living in the house. A woman had answered the door and told them, flatly, that there'd been a mix-up, that she was the owner's sister and this was actually her home now, and that the Whitfields should contact their booking site for a refund. I called Renee immediately, my hands cold before she even picked up. You told the Whitfields you're the owner? I told them there was a scheduling issue, she said, like the distinction mattered. I wasn't going to just let strangers walk in while my kids are sleeping there, Dana. What was I supposed to do? You were supposed to be gone 3 weeks ago. There was a pause, and then her voice shifted, hardening into something I hadn't heard from her before, something almost rehearsed. I did some research, she said. I've been here over 30 days now. That actually means something. Legally, tenant rights kick in at 30 days in this state, whether there's a lease or not. You can't just throw us out on the street. If you try, I'll fight it in court, and that could take months. Is that really what you want to put your husband through? I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment, letting that sink in. She'd counted the days. She'd looked up the statute. Somewhere in those 6 weeks of strep throat and job interviews and school scheduling conflicts, she'd been quietly building a case for herself, brick by brick, while I'd been giving her the benefit of the doubt. You act like I'm some kind of criminal, she said, into the silence I hadn't filled. I'm your husband's sister. I'm raising his niece and nephew in that house. You'd really drag us through court over a beach house you use, what, 4 weekends a year? That's not what this is about, and you know it. It's exactly what this is about. You've never liked me, not since the wedding. I've watched you count every little thing I've ever done wrong for 11 years, and now you finally get to use it. I didn't answer that because there was no answer that wouldn't have turned into a different argument entirely, one about every Christmas and every borrowed car and every unspoken grudge stretching back over a decade, and I didn't have the energy for it standing in my own kitchen with the phone shaking slightly in my hand. I told her we were coming down that weekend to sort it out in person. She said that was fine. She'd be there, like she had nothing at all to worry about. Ethan and I drove the 3 hours mostly in silence. He kept starting sentences and not finishing them. I kept my eyes on the road and my hands tight on the wheel and told myself over and over that this would be a conversation, an uncomfortable one, but a conversation, and it would end with Renee packing her car. It did not end that way. We pulled into the driveway a little before 10 at night and found a stranger's lock bolted into my grandmother's front door. The porch light Vivian used to leave on for late arrivals was on, just like she used to leave it, except now it was lighting up someone else's furniture through the window. There was a child's bike on its side in the yard, and a plastic sandbox near the porch steps that hadn't been there in May, and curtains in the front window that weren't the curtains I'd hung myself 2 summers earlier. That's the scene I already described at the very start of this. The chained door, Renee's face in the gap, the phone call to the police made in front of us, her voice pitched loud and wounded, accusing her own brother and his wife of trespassing on a property that had never once had her name on it. The officer who arrived 20 minutes later was polite and visibly uninterested in getting involved. He explained in the gentle tone cops use when they don't want to be the ones to ruin your night further, that this looked like a civil dispute now, something for a judge, not for for him. Renee had been living there over 30 days, she claimed. There might be occupancy rights involved. He suggested we not force our way inside and recommended, almost apologetically, that we speak to a lawyer in the morning. Renee stood in the doorway through the entire exchange, arms crossed, sipping from a coffee mug I recognized as my grandmother's, the one with the chipped rim shaped like a seashell. She didn't gloat exactly. She didn't need to. Her face did it for her. "You have 2 houses," she said, once the officer had walked back to his car. "I have none. My kids have a yard here. They have their own rooms. You want to take that away from them over what principle? That's not fair, and you know it. It was never yours to give them, Renee." "Fair is fair," she said again, like repeating it made it true. "A judge is going to see 2 adults with a second home fighting a mother and her children over a roof. You think that looks good for you? I've already talked to a lawyer. I know exactly what I'm doing." I remember standing in my grandmother's yard, in the dark, looking at a sandbox that didn't belong there, and understanding for the first time that this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was a plan. It had been a plan for weeks, maybe longer, and I'd been too busy being polite to see it forming. What Renee didn't know, standing there so sure of herself with her chipped seashell mug, was that she'd made one mistake that mattered more than all the rest combined. She'd registered her kids at the local elementary school using my address. She'd called the utility companies and put the water and electric into her own name. She thought that made her a tenant. What it actually made her, though she wouldn't understand this for another 11 days, was a paper trail. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. The call from Greg came the next morning, before 8. Greg Halloran had managed my grandmother's property, and then mine, for going on 9 years. He was 61, precise in a way that used to make me laugh, the kind of man who filed receipts by year and month before anyone asked him to. He didn't call to check in socially. He called because something in his own records had stopped making sense. "Your electric bill at Turn Lane jumped almost 40% in the last 6 weeks, he said. "I pulled the account this morning because Duke Energy sent an overdue notice. Except it's not overdue. Somebody's been paying it, just not you." I told him what had happened, the short version, still standing in the kitchen of the rental condo we'd booked for the weekend because we couldn't stay in our own beach house anymore. Greg went quiet for a second, and then he said something that stuck with me for a long time afterward. "There's no lease on file for anyone named Renee," he said. "No deposit, no signed anything. I've got 5 years of tenant records for that address, and her name doesn't appear on a single page of it." He offered to keep an eye on things from his end, and I told him to do whatever he thought was right, because at that point I genuinely didn't know what right looked like anymore. 3 days later, he called again, and this time his voice had an edge to it I'd never heard from him before. "You need to see something," he said. "I think you should sit down." Renee, it turned out, had filed for emergency housing assistance through Colton County's Department of Social Services 11 days earlier. The application required proof of tenancy, and she'd provided it in the form of 6 months of rent receipts, each one dated on the 1st of the month going back to October, each one for $800, each one bearing my signature. I hadn't signed anything. I hadn't received $1 from her. Not once, not in October, not ever. The forgeries weren't even good ones. Greg had a folder of my actual signed documents going back years, leases and repair authorizations and insurance forms, and he'd laid them side by side with the county paperwork, and could see immediately what any handwriting expert would confirm later. My signature had a distinctive loop on the D, a habit from childhood I'd never grown out of. Renee's forgery skipped the loop every single time, like she'd copied the shape of my name without ever actually watching me write it. The county caseworker assigned to Renee's application, a woman named Diane Ferris, called Greg directly to verify tenancy before releasing the funds, standard procedure for cases involving unconventional rental arrangements. Greg told her, plainly, that Renee had never signed a lease, never paid rent, and had no legal standing at the property whatsoever. He offered to send over 5 years of documented tenant history to prove it. Ferris thanked him and told him, in the careful, non-committal language caseworkers use, that this would need to be escalated. Greg emailed me scanned copies of the receipts 2 days later, and I sat at my kitchen table in Greensboro and looked at my own name written by someone else's hand for the first time in my life. It was a strange, violating feeling, seeing my signature used to vouch for a payment I'd never received, on a document meant to pull real money out of a county fund meant for families with nowhere else to turn. I thought about the people who actually needed that assistance, the ones filling out the same forms honestly, and felt something harden in me that hadn't been there before. Up until that point, some small part of me had still been holding space for the version of Renee who was just overwhelmed, just desperate, just a mother doing something regrettable under pressure. The forged receipts closed that space completely. This wasn't desperation. This was 6 months of dated documents, prepared in advance, ready to be produced the moment anyone asked. It escalated fast. Once fraud investigators started pulling threads, they found the second lie sitting right next to the first one, tangled into it so tightly, it was almost elegant in its stupidity. Renee had been collecting unemployment benefits since March, the same month she claimed she'd lost her job at the call center. Those benefits required her to certify every 2 weeks that she wasn't earning income. She'd certified it 8 times. And the whole time, she'd been working 3 nights a week at a bar called the Tide Line, 4 miles from the house she'd stolen, paid entirely in cash. Investigators pulled the bar's schedule and found her name on it going back to the 2nd week of March, listed arrested by her actual name, no attempt at concealment, as though it had never once occurred to her that two separate government agencies asking her the same basic question, "Are you employed?" might eventually compare notes. The bar's manager, a woman named Priscilla who'd hired Renee off a walk-in application, cooperated fully once investigators explained what they were looking into, handing over shift logs and even a handful of security camera stills time-stamped against the same weeks Renee had told the unemployment office she wasn't earning a dollar anywhere. I thought back to the black polo shirt Ethan had seen hanging in her closet weeks earlier, the one she'd waved off as nothing, extra cash, don't make it weird. It hadn't been nothing. It had been the second half of a lie she was telling two different systems at once, one to the county, one to the state, both of them built on the same shaky foundation of my forged signature: welfare fraud, identity theft, falsifying government documents. 3 charges, and investigators told Greg there might be a 4th once they finished untangling the utility fraud on top of it. I remember sitting on the edge of a stranger's bed in that rented condo, phone still warm against my ear, and feeling something I hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph, not yet. Just a strange, hollow kind of clarity, like a fog lifting off water at low tide, revealing all at once exactly how much had been hidden underneath it the whole time. They arrested her on a Tuesday afternoon, 11 days after the locks changed hands the first time. Ethan and I drove down that morning, not because we'd been asked to, but because Greg had warned us the investigators planned to execute a search of the property that day, and I couldn't stay away and pretend I didn't need to see it with my own eyes. We parked across the street close enough to watch, far enough to stay out of the way. 2 unmarked cars and a marked Colton County Sheriff's Cruiser sat in front of my grandmother's house, its blue shutters looking almost cheerful against all that gravity. Diane Ferris stood on the porch with a folder under her arm, next to a detective I later learned was named Ruiz. Greg was there too, his own folder considerably thicker than Ferris's, standing a respectful distance back with the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd been right about something for weeks and was finally being asked to prove it. Renee opened the door already talking, already defending herself before anyone had accused her of anything specific, which told me more than anything else could have. "I have receipts," she said, loud enough to carry across the yard. 6 months of them. "I paid that rent every single month. Ask her yourself. She signed every one." Ruiz asked to see them. She practically threw the folder at him, so certain, so sure this was the moment everything would finally tip in her favor. Greg stepped forward and handed over his own folder instead. 5 years of it, organized by year. Each tenant's signed lease and deposit record and payment history laid out in a paper trail Renee's fake receipts couldn't hope to survive standing next to. Ruiz flipped through both folders slowly, side by side, and I watched Renee's face change in real time as she realized what she was looking at. Real signatures with a looping D, fake ones without it, real leases with notarized signatures and initialed clauses, a single sheet of forged receipts that didn't match a single other document at that address, ever, in 5 years. "Where's your name on any of this?" Ruiz asked her, not unkindly, just factually. Renee didn't answer. For the first time since I'd known her, I watched her run out of a story to tell. Her mouth opened and closed once, some half-formed sentence dying before it reached air, and I realized I'd never once, in 11 years, seen her without a ready explanation for anything. It was almost disorienting to watch, like seeing a light switch flip and nothing turn on. "Ma'am, we're also going to need to ask you about the unemployment claims filed under your name since March," Ferris said, and that's when Renee's composure finally cracked all the way open. "You did this," she said, turning on me, her voice climbing. "You called them. You've been trying to take everything from me since the day I moved in here. You and your precious dead grandmother's house, like I'm not family, like my kids don't matter as much as your—" "Renee." Ethan's voice cut through hers, low and steady, the first time he'd spoken since we got out of the car. "Stop." She stopped, not because she wanted to, because something in his tone left no room for anything else. I stepped forward then, closer than I probably needed to be, close enough that she had to look right at me instead of past me at Ethan. "I gave you 2 weeks," I said. "You took 6. And then you forged my name on documents that could have gotten money meant for actual families in crisis. You put your kids' names on a school registration for a house you were never legally in. You called the police on me in front of my own front door for the crime of standing on my own property. This isn't about the house anymore, Renee. It never really was. It's about the fact that you have never once in your entire life been willing to just ask." She didn't say anything back. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't have made things worse for her, and even Renee in that moment seemed to understand that. Ruiz read her the charges standing right there on the porch, in the same voice he probably used a dozen times a week, flat and procedural, stripped of any drama at all, which somehow made it worse to listen to. Welfare fraud, identity theft, falsifying government documents. He asked her to turn around. She did, hands trembling, and I watched the cuffs go on over wrists that had, 6 weeks earlier, been placing a child's bike on its side in my grandmother's yard like she'd already won. A few of the neighbors had come out onto their own porches by then, the way people do when something is clearly happening down the street, and I watched Renee register their presence, watched something in her posture change once she understood she was being seen by more than just family. She'd spent 6 weeks performing certainty for an audience of 2, Ethan and me, and it had worked well enough on us for longer than it should have. It didn't work at all on strangers watching a woman get handcuffed on a stranger's porch in broad daylight. Whatever story she might have told them about scheduling issues or family disputes evaporated the moment Ruiz Ruiz said the word fraud, loud enough to carry across 2 front yards. "This isn't over," she said to me, as Ruiz walked her toward the cruiser, her voice lower now, stripped of its earlier bravado. "You'll regret this." I didn't answer her. There didn't seem to be any version of an answer that would have mattered to either of us in that moment, and some silences, I was learning, say more than anything you could fill them with. Tyler and Ava weren't there. Renee's neighbor from Charlotte, an older woman named Pat, who'd apparently been watching the kids while Renee sorted out some paperwork down at the beach house, called Ethan's mother in a panic once she saw the news alert on her phone. Some local outlet already running a headline about welfare fraud at a Marsh Cove address. That call was its own kind of terrible, and it would only get worse from there. The local news segment ran twice that week. A brief clip on the evening broadcast about a Marsh Cove welfare fraud case. No names shown on screen, but enough identifying detail. The street, the approximate dollar amount, that anyone who knew Renee could put the pieces together in about 4 seconds. A cousin on Ethan's side saw it and texted the family group chat before Carol had even had the chance to explain what was happening in her own words. And for a few days, the story took on a life separate from the actual facts of it, exaggerated in the retelling the way these things always are. By the time it reached my own mother, secondhand through a mutual friend, the version she'd heard involved me pressing criminal charges against my sister-in-law over a rent dispute. No mention of the forgery or the fraud at all. I spent an evening on the phone untangling that version for her, and it occurred to me, not for the first time, how much of this ordeal was going to involve correcting other people's half-formed understanding of what had actually happened for months, maybe years, after the legal part of it was already settled. Greg had a locksmith standing by before the sheriff's cruiser even finished backing out of the driveway. Within 2 hours, every lock on the house was mine again. The real ones. The ones that had turned smoothly in my hand for 5 years before Renee decided that didn't matter anymore. I stood on my grandmother's porch that evening as the sun went down over the sound in a house that finally, technically, belonged only to me again, and I didn't feel like celebrating. I felt like I was standing in the wreckage of something that used to be a family, wondering how much of it had actually been real in the first place, and how much of it had just been me, for years, agreeing not to notice. Renee's belongings went into a storage unit that same afternoon, packed by 2 guys Greg hired from a moving company he trusted, boxed without ceremony, labeled only by room. I texted her the storage unit's address myself, mostly because someone had to, and because I didn't trust anyone else to do it without adding something cruel. My hand shook the entire time I typed it, not from guilt exactly, more from the strange adrenaline of watching 6 weeks of someone else's life get folded down into cardboard boxes that fit in the back of a single truck. Her reply came back in under a minute. No thank you, no acknowledgement, just a string of accusations and threats, a promise that she'd sue me for everything I had, a claim that I'd engineered the entire fraud investigation just to hurt her. I didn't respond. There wasn't a version of a response that would have helped either of us. Ethan's mother, Carol, called that same night, crying before I'd even said hello. "She's in a bad place, Dana," Carol said. "You know that. You know what the divorce did to her. Can't you just drop the charges, let her make it right some other way? She has children." "I didn't file the charges, Carol. The county did. This isn't mine to drop. You could have handled it differently, quietly. Family doesn't do this to family. Renee did this to family first," I said. I just stopped protecting her from the consequences of it. Carol hung up on me without saying goodbye, and for 3 weeks after that, she didn't call at all. I told myself I understood. A mother defending her daughter is one of the oldest instincts there is, and I didn't hate her for it, even when it hurt to be on the other end of her silence. Not everyone in the family reacted that way, though, and some of the reactions surprised me more than Carol's did. Danny, Renee's ex-husband, called Ethan directly about a week after the arrest. He'd heard through Tyler and Ava, who'd been staying with him more since their mother's arrest, and he wanted to talk, not to defend Renee, but to say something that apparently had been sitting on his chest for years. He told Ethan that Renee had done something similar during their marriage, smaller in scale but the same shape, forging his signature on a refinancing document without telling him, years before the divorce, something he'd never reported because he didn't want to blow up the family they still had at the time. He said he was sorry he hadn't warned us sooner. He said he wished someone had warned him. Danny took the kids full-time after that, a custody arrangement that moved through family court faster than anyone expected, partly because Renee's pending criminal charges made the decision fairly straightforward for the judge. I felt for Tyler and Ava more than I let myself say out loud to anyone but Ethan, late at night, in the dark, when it was easier to admit that the people who suffer most in these situations are so rarely the ones who cause them. I sent Tyler and Ava a package that summer, nothing extravagant, just a couple of beach towels and a kite, and a note telling them the sound at Marsh Cove would still be there whenever they wanted to visit their uncle, no strings attached to anything their mother had done. Danny called to thank me for it, awkward and brief, and told me Ava had asked if Aunt Dana was mad at her. That question sat heavy in my chest for days. I wrote her a longer letter after that, careful and simple, telling her none of this was ever her fault or her brother's, that grown-ups sometimes make choices kids don't get a vote in, and that she was welcome at the beach house any summer she wanted, for as long as I owned it. Our next-door neighbor at Marsh Cove, a widower named Harold Voss, who'd lived on Turn Lane longer than my grandmother had, turned out to be an unexpected ally through all of it. He'd noticed Renee's kids playing in the yard back in March, and, being the kind of neighbor who paid attention, had quietly kept a log of who came and went, without anyone asking him to. He handed Greg a notebook full of dates and times once the investigation started, small confirming details that lined up with everything else, a moving truck on a Tuesday, a school bus stopping at the end of the driveway starting in early April. He told me when I thanked him that Vivian would have wanted someone watching out for the place, and that he'd been doing it out of habit since she passed, more than anything official. I hadn't known that. It made me look at the house a little differently after that, like it had been quietly held together by people I'd never fully appreciated while I wasn't looking. Greg turned out to be more than a property manager through all of this. He testified when it came time, with the same flat precision he brought to everything, laying out 5 years of clean records without a hint of drama. And afterward, he told me quietly that he'd suspected something was wrong from the very first week Renee moved in. The way she'd asked him, casually, what the 30-day rule actually meant for tenants in the state. He hadn't wanted to alarm me over what might have been an innocent question. He regretted that now, he said. I told him he had nothing to regret. He'd caught it faster than I had, and he'd caught it with paper, which mattered more than catching it with feelings ever would have. I asked him once, months later, over coffee at his office in Marsh Cove, why he'd kept such meticulous records for 9 straight years on a property that rarely gave him any trouble. He shrugged and said it was just how Vivian had trained him, back when he first started managing the place for her in the late 90s. She used to tell him, he said, that a house without paperwork was just a story waiting for someone to rewrite it however they wanted. I hadn't known her well enough as a young woman to remember her saying things like that, but it sounded exactly like something she would have said, and it made me miss her in a sudden, specific way I hadn't expected sitting in a property manager's office on an ordinary Tuesday morning. The lawyer called 3 days after the arrest. His name was Warren Kessler, and he had the smooth, unbothered voice of a man who did this kind of call often enough to make it sound routine. He said Renee wanted to make an offer, one that might spare everyone a long, expensive legal fight. He hadn't finished laying out the terms before Ethan reached over and took the phone straight out of my hand. She doesn't get anything, Ethan said. 4 words, flat and final, nothing left to negotiate inside them. He hung up before Kessler could respond. I stood there in our kitchen in Greensboro staring at my husband and felt something in my chest loosen for the first time in weeks. I hadn't realized how much I'd been bracing for Ethan to waver, to find some middle ground that let his sister off easier, the way he always had before. He didn't. Whatever line existed in him between family loyalty and basic decency, Renee had finally crossed it far enough that even he could see it clearly. That didn't mean it was easy for him. I watched my husband grieve his sister that spring in a way I hadn't expected, quiet and mostly private, a kind of mourning for a person who was still alive, still his sister, but who he no longer fully recognized. He'd sit on the back porch some evenings without saying much, and I'd bring him a beer and sit next to him and not push, because I understood, in my own way, that he was losing something too, even if what he was losing had maybe never been as solid as either of us wanted to believe. One night in late June, he finally said the thing he'd apparently been circling for weeks. I think I always knew, he said, staring out at our own backyard instead of at me. Every time, I told myself it was smaller than it looked. The car, the ring, the paint. I kept doing the math in a way that always came out in her favor, and I don't even know why anymore. I asked him what he thought the answer was, and he sat with that question longer than I expected before he finally said he thought it was easier to keep loving the version of Renee that existed in his memory, the little sister he used to walk to school, than to fully reckon with the version standing in front of him now. I didn't have anything better to offer than to tell him grief doesn't usually wait for the timing to make sense, and that he was allowed to feel it on whatever schedule it decided to show up on, even while I sat right next to him, still furious on his behalf. The legal fallout stretched on for months after that. The Whitfields, the couple who'd shown up to a rental they'd paid for in full only to find strangers living in it, had every right to be furious. And they were, initially. I refunded their entire stay out of my own pocket, plus an additional $200 for the inconvenience, and wrote them a long apology explaining exactly what had happened. They were gracious about it in the end, more gracious than I probably deserved, and they even rebooked for the following September once the whole ordeal had settled. Mrs. Whitfield told me on the phone, once things had calmed down, that she'd actually felt sorry for Renee in the moment, standing on the porch being told to leave a house she clearly believed was hers, and that it wasn't until I explained the forged receipts and the fraudulent county application that her sympathy curdled into something closer to disbelief. She looked me right in the eye and lied, Mrs. Whitfield said, still sounding faintly stunned by it months later. I don't think I've ever had someone do that so smoothly. I told her I understood the feeling completely and that it had taken me considerably longer than a single conversation to arrive at the same realization she'd reached in one afternoon on a stranger's porch. Renee's criminal case moved slowly, the way these things do. She eventually pleaded guilty to reduced charges, welfare fraud and falsifying documents, in exchange for the identity theft charge being dropped, a deal her public defender negotiated once it became clear the paper trail against her was airtight. She was sentenced to 18 months of probation, ordered to pay restitution to the county for the assistance funds she'd fraudulently attempted to collect, and required to complete a financial literacy course as a condition of her sentence, which felt, to me, like a strange and almost gentle irony, given everything. I went to the sentencing hearing in October, in a courtroom in the Colton County Courthouse that smelled smelled like old carpet and coffee from a machine down the hall. Renee sat beside her public defender in a gray blazer that looked borrowed, her hands folded on the table in front of her, and she didn't turn around once to look at the gallery, where Ethan and I sat 3 rows back, separated from Carol by a single empty seat neither of us moved to fill. The judge, a woman named Patricia Olin, read through the plea agreement in the same unhurried voice court proceedings always seemed to move in, and asked Renee if she had anything to say before sentencing was handed down. Renee stood, smoothed her blazer, and said she was deeply sorry for the stress this had caused her family, that she'd been under enormous pressure as a single mother, and that she hoped everyone could eventually move forward. She didn't mention my name. She didn't mention the forged signature, or the county funds, or the 6 weeks she'd spent insisting a temporary stay had somehow become a legal claim. It was, I thought, listening to her, a remarkably practiced apology for someone who'd had months to prepare it, and it apologized for almost nothing specific at all. Judge Olin handed down the 18 months of probation, the restitution order, and the financial literacy requirement without much comment, and the whole thing was over in under 20 minutes. I'd expected to feel something enormous walking out of that courtroom. Instead, I mostly felt tired, the particular tiredness that comes after months of bracing for something that, once it finally arrives, turns out to be smaller and more procedural than the version you'd been dreading in your head. She never spent a single night in jail beyond the initial booking. I used to think I'd feel cheated by that justice required something harsher, more visible. By the time her sentencing actually happened, though, I found I didn't need her in a cell to feel like something had been settled. What I needed had already happened months earlier, the moment a detective laid 2 folders side by side on my grandmother's porch and asked her where her name was on any of it, and she had nothing to say. The costs added up in ways I hadn't anticipated. We paid a real estate attorney $2,200 just to confirm, in writing, that Renee had no legal claim to occupancy despite her 30-day argument. Purely so we'd have documentation on hand if she tried anything through civil court once the criminal case wrapped up. She never did in the end, but the fear of it cost us real money anyway. Homeowners insurance covered part of the water damage under the sink, but balked at the drywall repair, calling it tenant damage, despite Renee never having been a tenant in any legal sense, which meant another round of phone calls and a formal letter from Greg's office before they agreed to pay out. Between the attorney, the repairs, and the refund to the Whitfields, we were out almost $9,000 by the time the dust settled. Money we eventually recovered in part through Renee's court-ordered restitution, paid back in slow monthly installments that still show up $70 at a time more than a year later. Ethan's father, a quiet man named Bill who rarely weighed in on family conflict, surprised everyone by driving down to Marsh Cove alone the week after the arrest, without telling Carol he was going. He walked the property with Greg, asked pointed questions about what had actually happened, and left without saying much of anything to me directly. 2 weeks later, he sent me a card in the mail, old-fashioned and slightly formal, telling me he was sorry for what Renee had put us through, and that Vivian would have handled it exactly the way I had. It was 3 sentences long. I read it more times than I probably should admit. The house itself needed real repairs before we could rent it out again. Water damage under the kitchen sink, a stain nobody had bothered mentioning during the chaos, a broken porch step, a hole in the drywall in the smaller bedroom that Greg guessed was from a door being slammed one too many times. We spent close to $6,000 getting it back to what it had been, and I remember standing in the newly repainted living room, the color exactly matched to what it had been before, thinking about my grandmother's black-painted equivalent story from years earlier, and how history in this family seemed to keep circling back around to the same shape, different rooms, same refusal to just ask. It's been over a year now since the locks changed hands the first time, and I still catch myself some mornings, running a hand along the door frame in the smaller bedroom, half expecting to find Ava's pencil marks still there. Greg had the wall repainted along with everything else, so they're gone now, but I think about them more often than makes sense for something so small. Ethan and I still go down to Marsh Cove once a month in the summer, same as always, though the drive feels different now, quieter in a way that isn't entirely bad. The house is back to what it was, faded blue shutters, the wraparound porch that catches the wind around 6 in the evening. Greg still sends his statements on the 1st of every month, still finds a way to make me laugh with some dry comment about a renter who left the grill uncleaned. The Whitfields came back that September, just like they promised, and Mrs. Whitfield hugged me on the porch like nothing had ever gone wrong at all. Carol and I talk again, though carefully, the way people talk after something has cracked and been glued back together with the cracks still visible if you look closely enough. She's never quite apologized, not directly, but she stopped defending Renee out loud around me, which I've come to understand is its own kind of apology, from a mother who doesn't know how to give the other kind. We had dinner together in January, just the 2 of us, at a small Italian place halfway between Greensboro and her house, neutral ground neither of us had to host. Halfway through the meal, she set her fork down and told me, quietly, that she'd known for years Renee took things that weren't hers, going all the way back to the ring, and that she'd always found a way to explain it away because the alternative, actually confronting it, felt like more than she could carry as a mother. I kept thinking if I just loved her enough, she'd stop needing to take things, Carol said. I never once considered that loving her that way was part of what let it keep happening. I didn't have a tidy response to that. I just reached across the table and put my hand over hers chairs, and we sat there for a while without saying much else. Two women who'd both, in our own ways, spent years being too gentle with someone who mistook gentleness for permission. Renee finished her probation this spring. I heard she's working steadily now, a real job, taxes and all, and that Tyler and Ava split time between her and Danny in an arrangement that seems to be working, mostly, as well as these arrangements ever do. I don't talk to her. I don't imagine I ever will again. Not really. And I've made a kind of peace with that. The way you make peace with a scar that stopped hurting a long time before it stopped being visible. Ava sent me a drawing last month, through Danny, of a house with blue shutters and a stick figure family standing on the porch. I put it on the refrigerator and left it there. And some mornings I catch myself looking at it while the coffee brews, thinking about how children forgive faster and more completely than adults ever manage to, and how that's probably a mercy and a tragedy in equal measure. Harold still waves from his porch every time we pull in. Greg still calls on the first of the month. The house still smells like salt and cedar the second you open the front door, exactly the way it did when Vivian was alive. And some part of me still expects to find her in the kitchen every time I walk in, humming something off-key, entirely unbothered by any of this, the way she was unbothered by most things that didn't actually matter. I think about that night in the driveway more than I expected to, a year out. Renee's face in the gap of the chained door, the chipped seashell mug in her hand. Fair, she called it, staring me dead in the eye. Like fairness was something you could manufacture just by insisting on it hard enough. Like taking something that isn't yours becomes justified the moment you want it badly enough. She swore a judge would never take her precious new home away from her. She said it more than once, to more than one person, in the weeks before it all came apart. I think about that phrase sometimes, precious new home, because it was never that. It was never hers to lose in the first place, which meant no judge ever had to take anything from her at all. She'd built an entire fortress of certainty around a house she had no legal claim to, brick by forged brick. And in the end, it came down not because a judge ruled against her, but because the truth simply couldn't hold the weight she'd stacked on top of it. That's the part I keep coming back to. The part I'd tell anyone standing where I stood that night if they ask. People like Renee don't get undone by confrontation. I confronted her plenty, gently at first, then not so gently, and none of it moved her an inch. What undoes people like that is their own certainty, their own conviction that the rules simply don't apply to them, pushed just one step further than the truth can survive. She didn't get caught because I was clever. She got caught because she believed her own story so completely that she stopped checking whether it matched anyone else's paperwork. I lost something in all of this that I don't think I'll ever fully get back, and I want to be honest about that instead of pretending this ends in some clean, uncomplicated victory. I lost the version of my husband's family I used to believe existed, the one where everyone loved each other messily but honestly, where a black-painted living room and a crushed bumper were just quirks instead of warnings. I lost a sister-in-law I used to hope, in some small back corner of my heart, I might actually grow close to one day before all of this. Some nights I still grieve that version of things, the one that never got to exist outside of my own hopefulness. But I kept the house. I kept my husband, who chose 4 words over his sister's comfort, the day it mattered most. I kept my own name, my own signature, the looping D that Renee could never quite copy, no matter how many times she tried, sitting now on documents that are entirely, unquestionably mine again. Some nights, sitting on that porch as the sun drops behind the sound, I think that's the real inheritance my grandmother left me. Not the house itself, though I love it fiercely, and always will. She left me the understanding that the people who take without asking will eventually run out of things to take, and that standing your ground quietly, without screaming, without begging anyone to see it your way, is sometimes the loudest thing you can do. I used to think family loyalty meant absorbing whatever a person did to you, over and over, in the name of keeping the peace. I don't think that anymore. I think real loyalty looks more like what Ethan finally offered me, 4 flat words down a phone line, than it ever looked like the years of quiet accommodation that came before it. Loyalty that requires you to keep shrinking yourself, keep explaining away the ring and the bumper and the black paint and the pencil marks on a doorframe that was never hers, isn't loyalty at all. It's just fear wearing a nicer word. I didn't understand the difference until I watched my husband choose me over his own sister in a single sentence, and I don't think I'll ever mistake the two again. I didn't scream that night in the driveway. I went quiet instead. It turned out that was exactly enough.